Hello, everyone. Today I'm reviewing Chapter 2, Being Accurate, Relying on the Facts. Now, most of you are probably familiar with the telephone game. If you aren't, this is a game where one person passes a message to the next person in a line, and you try to make the message that the original person had the same as the one at the end. Whenever you play that game, a lot of times the message gets jumbled up and it doesn't end up being the same one whenever you get to the end of the line. And this is a very similar thing that happens whenever we're talking about passing information online, or in general, really, when you're communicating with people, you want to be as close to the original source as possible. And that way you can ensure that you are getting the most accurate version of that message, of that information, and generally giving that information to your audience, especially as a communicator and a media writer. So, when we talk about media writing, of course, one of the first things you're doing, you're communicating. So, you want to make sure that you are informing your audience, that you are giving them the information that they need to make decisions in their everyday life. And sometimes whenever you are looking at your audience, for example, if you're working in advertising or as a public relations person, then there might be a shared benefit between your original message that the organization that hired you wants to promote and your audience. So you want to make sure that you are communicating effectively and providing that bridge between the organization and their audience. And one of the ways that you can make sure you're sharing those benefits appropriately and that you are doing the best communicating that you can is by providing accurate information. And whenever you are accurate and you're consistent, then you're able to develop reliability and become a reliable source for your audience. So, when we talk about reliability in media writing, we're looking at including reliable primary sources, and we'll go over what those look like in just a second. You also want to provide direct quotes and facts from those sources of information. And you also want to include a healthy dose of skepticism, especially if you are someone who is maybe an influencer or if you're working as a journalist, then you want to make sure that you aren't just taking people at their word. Even if you're working within a company as an advertising person, you want to make sure that you are including correct information for your audience and that you are double and triple checking your facts when you're developing your work. And also check your grammar, check your spelling, check your math. It seems like such a simple thing, but very often those kinds of slips can reduce your reliability. And then people won't believe you whenever you start talking about bigger things like your information that you're relaying from other sources. So let's talk about finding reliable sources. What does that look like when we're finding reliable sources? Well, nowadays, it's very different than back in the pre-internet era. Anyone can start a website or a post to social media groups. This is part of why it's so hard to find reliable information sometimes. And there's just a glut of information and sources online many of which are in that quasi reliability section where maybe they're quoting a person who quoted a person and they aren't really the originator of information. Or even if they are, I mean, sometimes people post false information because they want to get clicks or they want to find a way to boost their numbers and stuff online. So, how do you find reliable sources? Well, first of all, look for primary or original sources of information. What does that mean? That means looking for people with firsthand knowledge, people who are developing that new biomedical procedure, or people who are actually out there. Um, let's say you're doing a story on driving for Uber, then you want to actually talk to an Uber driver and see how they're doing out there. Or if we're talking about farming, for example, right now the crawfish prices are really high. You might talk to crawfish farmers or people who own their own some of those seasonal crawfish restaurants and see how this is affecting their businesses. So look for people with that firsthand knowledge and firsthand perspective. That again could be field experts. It could even be press releases. And whenever you include this information, of course, you want to explain to your audience where you found it. Make sure that they know you are quoting this other source directly or indirectly. Um, so they know exactly where your facts are coming from. Now, secondary sources, when we talk about a secondary source, they are retelling primary source information. So, for a lot of you, if you're working in broadcasting or in journalism, then you are a secondary source of information. You are providing information that you found somewhere else. Occasionally, you might be a tertiary source if you're quoting another group who's quoting someone. So that's a third level and not really the best choice for for relaying information. But when we talk about secondary sources, this is someone who is retelling primary source information. So you read a press release and you are providing that summary of that information to your audience. Or maybe there was a recent journal publication that was very interesting and you want to include some information from it in your newscast. Then you would be a secondary source because the journal would be a primary source of peer reviewed information. So, again, when we talk about secondary sources, they have information based on the original source. Uh, Now, if we are talking about someone who is referring to a secondary source, that means that they are on the third level, a tertiary source, and it is not a good source of information for you as a media writer. It also is generally not the best way to report things. We're starting to get too far away from the main source of information. So your best choice when you're writing for media is to look for at least two primary or original sources. It is possible to use secondary sources again, but the best thing would be two primary sources. So think about this question. Would an expert interview qualify as a reliable source? What kind of source would they be? All right. So when we talk about expert interviews, it while it does involve a journalist in there in the mix, or a reporter or someone, we're usually relaying information that we're quoting directly from the interview. Um, so that expert opinion is a firsthand account and a primary source. However, if you are summarizing the information, then you're providing information as a secondary source. So when you are rewording things, that's when it starts becoming a secondary source. Now, here are two more examples. So think about, what is a magazine? Well, majority of the time when we look at magazines, they are going to be different from a peer reviewed journal. If you are quoting information you found in an online blog or magazine, then you are looking at something that is already a secondary or possibly even a tertiary source, depending on who they're quoting. So we're looking at second or third level pieces of information in magazines. Peer reviewed journals, again, are mostly, like 9 times out of 10, they are going to be primary sources of information. Pretty much, I would venture to say almost a 10 out of 10 case. The only reason it would be different is if we're looking at something that is a meta analysis. Now, a meta analysis is where they are taking a bunch of other previously published work, looking at it, and then analyzing that work to come to a certain conclusion. Um, in that case, it is arguable that it would be a kind of a secondary source, but even then, we're still looking at something with original research. Now, things you should not cite for this class or later on if you're working in broadcasting or journalism. Encyclopedias. Encyclopedias are excellent ways of finding quick pieces of information. They are great for general knowledge. However, they are already summarizing information from other locations. So they are usually uh, places where they're collecting and summarizing information. So we're looking at secondary sources already. And a lot of them, like Encyclopedia Britannica, do still exist online. And they do have professionals who work on them. I mean, even Wikipedia sometimes does. However, especially in cases like wiki articles, those are not as thoroughly vetted as a like primary source journal or interview might be. So don't use those for your work. Some other things when we look at articles referencing other documents. I say documents specifically because you can usually find the document yourself. You can find that press release. You can find that interview that was written out with a particular group, or you can find a audio copy of it or a video or something. So if it's a work referencing another document, look for links in the work, the hypertext stuff to connected to the original document. If you can't find it, do a web search. That's why you have it. So look for your original sources of information and click on article links to help you find what you need. Um, so while it is okay to read encyclopedias and articles and all that kind of stuff, and they're great for starting points when you're figuring out what topic to cover, do not stop there. You need to click those links, look for those primary sources of information, or at minimum, some kind of very reliable secondary source. So there it is. All right. Now let's look at quoting sources. Now that we know what kinds of sources qualify as primary or secondary, how would you include them in your work? Well, short answer, direct quotes and paraphrasing. You are going to either directly quote or paraphrase or indirectly quote original sources. And that could include interviews that you conduct or that you find recordings of. It could be press releases, website pages, etc. Now, you want to paraphrase secondary source material only if the original work is unavailable. excuse me, sometimes a page is taken down, and if you are no longer able to access that primary work, then yes, a secondary source mentioning it may be your only option. However, you still need to have more information on the topic. And of course, no matter how you are including the information, always mention your source. Where did you find this information? Let your audience know so that way they aren't having to take you at your word. Now, here's an example of paraphrasing or indirectly quoting someone or something. The Lafayette Public Library System won't have to extend a road to build the Northeast Regional Library. At a meeting Monday, the Lafayette Planning Commission waived a Lafayette Development Code requirement to extend a road, which could have killed the project. So, when you look at this, you can see we're introducing the idea of what happened with our first sentence. So, what's happening? The Lafayette Public Library System won't have to extend a road to build the Northeast Regional Library. And how did we get this information? There was a meeting on Monday with the Lafayette Planning Commission, and during the meeting, the LPC said they would waive that development code for a road extension because it may have stopped the project from happening at all. So we have our why in here as well. So they're summarizing information from the meeting. If we wanted to include a little more from it, let's say someone said something that had a lot of impact, then you might have a direct quote after this as well. So let's look at how a direct quote might appear. Here's a different example. State Senator Cleo Fields confirmed on Tuesday what political insiders had expected. He will run for the new Black majority district created last week by Governor Jeff Landry and state legislators. And now you'll see this little ellipsis in the little box right here. That's to show there were sections cut out, so we could get straight to this direct quote. And open quotes, I will formally announce my candidacy in the next several weeks, but I want to be clear, I am a candidate, comma, close quotes, Fields said in a statement, period. So right there, we can see that this is from a statement released by Fields, not from an interview or from anything else. So we could actually look for the statement released by Fields' office. If a lot of times politicians will either on whatever, since he is a state senator, I'm sure he has his own webpage. We could find that webpage and look for the news release on there. So, whenever you're collecting information, you don't want to take anyone at their word. It's important to maintain a certain degree of skepticism, no matter who your source is, and look for more information. So, you want multiple expert sources. That could mean looking for original documents, whether it's press releases or peer reviewed journals, or maybe a bill that was from a government agency, or a copy of a meeting agenda or something like that. And you also want to look for government or internationally accredited organizations. Now, I understand some people have a little more skepticism about government related projects. The main reason I include that specific aspect of it is because most of these people really are just professionals who are experts in their field, and they are focused on finding answers to questions. They aren't necessarily focused on a particular agenda. Um, if you're looking at press releases, of course, those are usually designed to answer an audience's questions. So, depending on the agency or who's releasing it, There, a lot of times things from the FDA, for example, are very matter of fact and straightforward. Sometimes, if it's from a group with more of a political bent, there might be a little more of that in the press release. It's kind of a thing where you have to go through and use your own judgment. Um, but again, this is part of why we include more than one source of information. And you also want to cross check interviews and other sources whenever possible. So look for those interview recordings, or, if you are interviewing people, you want to interview multiple experts and if see if they have differing opinions. And if they do, then look for other sources of information to help you figure out if one of them is right or wrong about something. And whenever I say multiple sources, it isn't looking for the same information republished by different groups. Like if we see an article from space.com where they're talking about NASA, and then you also have a press release from NASA with the same information, well, where do you think space.com got their information? From NASA. So make sure that you are looking at different agencies or different organizations or different people who aren't like affiliated with they may be affiliated with similar groups, but they aren't going to have identical information unless it's something where, uh, they both separately conducted tests and came to the same conclusion. So when we're looking for sources, you also want to select your sources based on what you need. For example, if I want to learn more about space travel, two of the organizations I might interview would be NASA and the European Space Agency, or ESA. So these are separate expert organizations. However, they both discuss the same topics. So they're while they, again, are separate, they are not connected in the sense of one being uh, like within the same organization. Think about like with Amazon, for example, the Prime Video service and the Prime Music are all under the Amazon masthead, or like with Facebook and Instagram being under Meta. In this case, NASA and ESA are two different organizations. They may work together, but they are not the same thing. So, again, when you're looking for experts, separate, but discussing the same topic. So, how would you check sources? Well, you're going to interview people, review materials, and compare the answers based on what you find. An example, let's say you interview someone and this first person says 2 plus 2 equals 5. Well, you want to get a second opinion about that. So you interview another person and this person says 2 plus 2 equals 4. Well, now you have two different opinions. Both of them are experts. They both say different things, but they're since they are both experts, you're going to look for a third unrelated source. It could be another expert, another person, or it could be a journal article on the topic that was not published by either of these people, and see if that answer lines up with one of the two that you were given. Now, it is possible sometimes for it to be a third answer, in which case, good luck. All you can do is provide your audience with that information. If you have a third person and they agree with one of the other two previous people, then, you know, including all three of them is still important. You do still want to include all of those different opinions, but you can point out that, hey, these two experts who are not related both came to a different conclusion from the other expert interviewed. Now let's look at fact checking. Now, fact checking, of course, includes a lot of things like interviews. It also includes spelling and making sure that your historical references are accurate, that you have the correct dates, um, making sure that numbers like money and percentages are accurate, that you double and triple check everything. Even when someone gives it to you, you want to go back and add and subtract that information to make sure that it really does come out the way they say. Otherwise, you may be sharing misinformation. And also look at locations. Make sure you have the correct street numbers, abbreviations, names. One example would be if there's a story about White Castle. Well, if it's White Castle, Louisiana, that is a totally different place from White Castle, the burger restaurant. Now, there are some terms you should avoid. Vague terms like recently or arguably, logical lapses like saying always, never, or the best or the worst. Those are logical lapses because it's extremely, extremely unlikely for anything to ever always be the same or not, always going to be something, or it's never going to be that, or that this is the greatest show on earth. Uh, those are lapses in judgment. And there are also instances of hyperbole, which is, again, an extreme exaggeration. This is where we're talking about something where you say there are thousands of people here. Well, unless you counted how many people were there and there were uh, thousands, then you are exaggerating it. And it's instead, you want to provide well researched facts, include accurate numbers, like there were 800 people, not thousands, or that yes, this really, according to the Guinness World Record, this really is the world's largest ball of twine. So, again, checking your facts, including accurate information. This isn't the time to editorialize or include vague information. When you use vague terms, it shows that you were, frankly, being kind of lazy and not looking up information. So look up that information. All right. Now, your homework for today, finish reading chapter 2. We are going to have group Jeopardy on Friday, and it will cover the past few lectures. So, AP style book, APA formatting, and chapters 1 and 2. Review those key terms as well as the chapter information, and complete today's quiz. So, the Wednesday quiz. There is also a source reliability forum. I have opened it a little ahead of Friday. So make sure you get the source reliability forum completed. There's a short article explaining source reliability and a couple of questions for you to answer. We're going to go over it a little on Monday as well, so we can discuss reliability as a class. All right. I will see you on Friday.